Hello UTF, it's been a while. I saw your video about anarchists and why you don't like them. If anyone wants to see the video I'm talking about, which I suggest you do before watching this one, the link is in the description. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to respond as quickly as I would have liked because I've been away for a wee bit. I've had to have an operation on my ear which I've been recovering from for the best part of 2 weeks, but nevertheless, I'm fine now. So, without further ado, let's get started. Firstly, there are a lot of people who call themselves anarchists, but nevertheless have opposing beliefs. You've got post-leftists, primitivists, anarcho-capitalists, left-wing market anarchists, individualists, mutualists, collectivists, communists, and also people who call themselves anarchists and say that they want to destroy the passer-by in an attempt to shock people, to try and sell records, and so on and so forth. All of these people have different beliefs and advocate different strategies to achieving their goals. You've got agorism, although this is mostly associated with the irrelevant ANCAPs, insurrectionary anarchism, illegalism, platformism, synthesis anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, prefigurative politics, affinity groups, worker solidarity, mutual aid, and so on and so forth. And some of these strategies are more popular than others. And so we have our initial problem. At no point in your video do you make it sufficiently clear what you mean by the term anarchism, anarchy, or anarchists, let alone a definition of anarchism given by someone who actually identifies as an anarchist. Now, for anyone who's aware of the fact that there are many different people with opposing views who all use the same word anarchism to describe their beliefs, this is deeply problematic, because you have not made it clear who you're actually referring to. Although you never give a coherent definition of what you think anarchism means, there are a number of statements dispersed throughout your video which collectively give somewhat of a general idea of what you seem to think anarchism means.
Anarchy is anarchy. It's chaos. Pissing and moaning and whining and groveling about all these laws and these cops and the traffic laws and all this kind of stuff. You know what? Kiss my ass. This lawless, permissive, independent, exempt society with no government, no police, no tax. It ain't happening. Ever. No laws, no tax, no nothing. Okay, fine. You're on your fucking own. But to say that getting rid of all the rules is gonna fix everything? I was an anarchist at one point. All these rules I was breaking, talking out of turn, running down the hall screaming, fuck everything, fuck you all, pulling my penis out in the middle of class. If you don't think police have the right to impose laws upon you, laws that are made by lawmakers, laws that are made by these states that everybody else has to follow, then go out there and break them. These are the extreme things anarchists have to resort to advocate their cause. Go out there and weave in and out of traffic, Go out there and be a reckless driver. Go break every speed limit you possibly can. Like the Vandal song Anarchy Burger says, go into the deli and urinate on the cheese. Go piss on every wall you can. Go defecate in every alley you possibly can, okay? Go punch people randomly.
What I gathered from this, although it really wasn't clear, was that you seem to think that anarchism is just the abolition of the state. Nothing more, nothing less. And the reason why anarchists wish to abolish the state is because they believe that people have the right to engage in some or all of the actions that are forbidden by the state. Thus, anarchists wish to achieve their goals, the abolition of the state, through the engagement in some or all of these illegal actions that are prohibited by the state. In other words, breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law. This representation of anarchism is about 5% true, and has almost no connection to what mass anarchist movements have been about historically. Now, if you're going to criticise something, you ought to criticise the best possible representation of it. That's intellectual honesty. However, you've done the exact opposite, and you've decided to criticise the worst possible representation of it. And so, this is a classic straw man.
This is the circle of reason, right here. This is the middle of the circle of reason. These guys are somewhere over here, down here.
Oh, well, allow me to retort.
A straw man, also known in the UK as an Aunt Sally, is a common type of argument and is an informal fallacy based on the misrepresentation of an opponent's argument. To be successful, a straw man argument requires that the audience be ignorant or uninformed of the original argument. Now, with something like anarchism, which is far outside of mainstream political discourse, you've basically hit the jackpot. The so-called typical attacking a strawman argument creates the illusion of having completely refuted or defeated an opponent's position by covertly replacing it with a different proposition, i.e. stand up a strawman, and then to refute or defeat that false argument, knock down the strawman instead of the original proposition. This is basically what you've done with this video. To give the best possible representation of anarchism, I'm going to argue from the libertarian socialist or social anarchist position. Why? Because it's the largest school of thought within anarchism and the only to constitute a mass social movement and put some of its ideas into practice. Social anarchists tend to describe their beliefs as a process rather than a fixed idea, in which you look around you, you identify structures of hierarchy, privilege and domination, and you make a very reasonable challenge. Prove your legitimacy. Now, if the people exercising the power cannot prove their legitimacy, then the hierarchy in question should be dismantled and replaced with horizontal organisation instead. This is what I mean by anarchism. First of all, yes, it's true that anarchists do wish to abolish the state. However, defining anarchism by this only is inaccurate, primarily because the state isn't the only form of hierarchy in our society that anarchists wish to dismantle. For example, we also want to establish socialist economic systems based on workers' control over production as opposed to capitalism. And by the way, if there are any liberals in the audience, socialism does not mean anything a government does. The point here is, while all anarchist societies are stateless, not all stateless societies are anarchist. Secondly, contrary to popular belief, anarchists do not believe that people should have the right to go around doing whatever the hell they want, regardless of the harm caused to anyone else. This is evidenced by the fact that anarchists advocate certain forms of sanctions in which members of a social group can indicate their approval or disapproval towards a given mode of conduct, either through a reaction or through the threat or promise of a reaction. We can distinguish between diffuse sanctions, organised sanctions, hierarchically organised sanctions, and legal sanctions. Legal sanctions are inherently violent, whereas diffuse, organised and hierarchically organised sanctions can be violent or non-violent. A diffuse sanction is the spontaneous expression of approval or disapproval towards a given mode of conduct by members of the group acting as individuals, and is thought to be a sanction that, generally speaking, every member of the group has the right, and usually also the responsibility, to perform. For example, gossip, public humiliation, or punching someone. Organised sanctions are sanctions that are imposed by a social group acting collectively, and whose exact content is determined by precisely regulated social procedures. For example, an activist group might collectively ask a member to leave a meeting because they are excessively drunk in accordance with the group's preconceived rules and regulations. Hierarchically organised sanctions are sanctions that are imposed by a specific group of individuals within a social group who are thought alone to have the right and responsibility to impose the sanction. For example, a university professor being granted tenure by their university's management. A legal sanction is a sanction that is imposed on individuals by either the threat of violence or use of violence by a specific group of individuals within a social institution that has, amongst others, the defining social role of enforcing said sanctions. These individuals alone have the authority to threaten or perform acts of violence in order to impose the sanction. Anarchists seek a society containing diffuse sanctions, organised sanctions, and hierarchically organised sanctions of a very specific sort, but seek to abolish legal sanctions. Thus, anarchists do not advocate a society in which individuals receive no sanctions for highly immoral behaviour, such as murder or rape, and do not advocate a society in which such sanctions are not highly organised. I apologise to bore you with some fairly complex social science, but nevertheless it illustrates the fact that this position is vastly different from the misrepresentation that you gave, in which there's no rules and everybody just runs around doing whatever the hell they want. Anarchists merely seek to abolish a particular type of sanction and the historic institution which enforces them, namely the state. Now, what do we mean by the state? We mean any particular institution which has the following three features. 1. It's able to mobilise the means of violence to sustain its rule over a given territorial area, in part through the enforcement of legal sanctions. 2. It's organised in a centralised and hierarchical manner. And 3. It's organised by a class of professional rulers. So why do we oppose this? It's not because we have some inexplicable desire to do everything that the state considers illegal and break the law for the sake of breaking the law. There are a variety of reasons why anarchists oppose the state, and I'll run through a few of them just now. First of all, states are inherently nationalistic institutions. They thrive on generating patriotism and jingoistic fanaticism within the population. They want the masses to believe that the people in that state over there are not deserving of equal treatment to the people in this state over here, because it helps to maintain a docile and obedient population that are far easier to control and ascribes legitimacy to the nation state. It's very easy for nationalism to devolve into racism, and we all know what that looks like. States also have an inherent tendency to seek war and territorial expansion, and thus encourage nationalism to garner support for such activities that are necessitated by its very structure. States are structured such that they require the rule of a minority over the majority, which also generates economic stratification. This is why revolutionary socialist movements that have centred around taking state power have ultimately failed to produce an equitable society in the past, merely replacing capitalism in its traditional sense with an unaccountable bureaucracy that structures the economy in its own interests. Now, in my Red Bureaucracy video, I go into more extensive detail about why this is the case. States also have a mutually beneficial relationship with economic elites existing outside of the state. That is, of course, if you're talking about a typical capitalist democracy. Contradiction in terms, in my opinion, but nevertheless, let's continue. Why is this the case? Well, we can look at Thomas Ferguson's investment theory of party competition, which outlines in detail how political parties will align themselves with the economic interests of business elites, with several historical examples throughout the 20th century. We can also look at Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's propaganda model, and one component of this model is the economic reliance of the commercial media on the state as a source of information. The tendencies of the state towards militarism and nationalism also make it inherently serviceable to the capitalist class. Militarism because it helps generate handy profits for elites through arms manufacturing and the plundering of natural resources that we all depend on to survive. And nationalism because it divides the working class and distracts people from their common interests in relation to the means of production. Now, if working class people become aware of their own interests, then the state can provide another service to the capitalist class: repression. If you take actions such as striking, occupying, protesting, or taking direct action, then the police will be deployed to ensure that existing institutions and power relations remain fundamentally intact. And it is this primary function of the police force that anarchists are critical of. It's nothing to do with crime. They uphold the class society which causes crime in the first place. And this is a matter that I'll talk about in part 2. All you need to do is remember the golden rule, which is very simple. He who owns the gold makes the rules. In a nutshell, anarchists oppose the state because it generates nationalism and racism, seeks war and territorial expansion, and not only is it a form of economic stratification in itself, but also its actions provide a service to economic elites acting outside of the state by aiding them in wars to gain control of resources, while dividing and repressing the working class, both through ideology and through violence. This is the anarchist critique of the state. It's not because, we don't like the laws. Let's talk about strategy. Now, the vast majority of anarchists do not advocate illegalism, that is, embracing criminality as a lifestyle, as a strategy, apart from perhaps post-leftists. But again, these people are basically annoying and really irrelevant. So again, this is a very, very inaccurate representation. We do not advocate breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law as some kind of a strategy for achieving social change. Most anarchists will advocate a diverse set of tactics, provided that the tactics utilised are consistent with their ends and conducive towards bringing about a society which is as non-hierarchical as possible. To give some brief examples, anarchists will use consensus decision-making in their organisations rather than hierarchical methods of decision-making. We support worker co-ops, housing co-ops, free shops, and in general, creating institutions that give people a space to manage their own affairs, whether that's in the workplace or elsewhere. Anarchists also advocate union organising, some advocating Anarcho-syndicalism or revolutionary industrial unionism as a strategy for the working class to gain control of an economy and consequently influence the broader society. Anarchists also recognise that because we do not have participatory democratic control of economic institutions in our existing society, during life under capitalism in a non-revolutionary situation, we understand that it's in the interest of the working class to have social democratic policies as a palliative measure. This is why anarchists will demonstrate against austerity measures and advocate increasing government funding for education, the health service, welfare and so on, while still remaining anarchists. However, this will no longer be necessary once the means of production are under popular control rather than state and corporate control. Now, although you do say that you respect anarchists to a certain extent for supporting laws that reduce corruption, you don't seem to understand the underlying reasoning behind this. And yes, if circumstances demand it, anarchists will sometimes break the law, if doing so would lead to desirable consequences for the working class and the great majority of humanity. Good people disobey bad laws, and there are many situations in which disobeying the law is a highly moral thing to do. Noam Chomsky, in his debate with Michel Foucault, illustrates this point very well.
One does not necessarily allow the state to define what is legal. Now, the state has the power to enforce a certain concept of what is legal, but power doesn't imply justice or correctness even. So the state may define something as civil disobedience and may be wrong in doing so. For example, in the United States, the state defines it as civil disobedience to, let's say, derail an ammunition train that's going to Vietnam. And the state is wrong in defining that as civil disobedience because it's legal and proper and should be done. It's proper to carry out actions that will prevent the criminal acts of the state, just as it's proper to violate a traffic ordinance in order to prevent a murder. If I was standing at a street corner and the traffic light were red, let's say I was standing in my car and I drove across the traffic light to prevent somebody from, let's say, machine gunning a group of people, of course that's not violation of law. It's an appropriate and proper action. No sane judge would convict you for such an action. Similarly, a good deal of what the state authorities define as civil disobedience is not really civil disobedience. In fact, it's legal, in fact, obligatory behavior in violation of the commands of the state, which may or may not be legal commands. So one has to be rather careful about calling things illegal, I think.
Now, at the start of the video, you showed this ridiculous Facebook meme complaining about being pulled over for speeding. And you cite this as an example of the extreme things that anarchists must resort to achieve their goals. First of all, Facebook memes aren't an appropriate way to gain an understanding of a complex political philosophy and a historical movement. Secondly, having looked at it, it sounds like something an ANCAP would say, considering that ANCAPs basically treat dealing with the police as though it's some kind of a game. And the way that you described this person later on in the video complaining about taxes, yeah, they definitely sounded like an ANCAP. You went on to mention a number of things involving breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law, like pissing on the cheese, shitting in an alleyway, pissing on all of the walls, and going out into the street and punching everyone that you see. Now, obviously, from an anarchist perspective, none of these actions would help further the interests of the working class, so I don't see what the point would be for anarchists to engage in these activities. It's not as if we're going to gain democratic control of productive resources through the cunning use of unrelenting urine and diarrhea. To conclude, the way that you portrayed anarchism in your video was fundamentally inaccurate on a number of levels. You failed to demonstrate any awareness of the relevant distinctions between different ideologies describing themselves as anarchist. And you failed to define clearly what you seem to think anarchists believe. You made a series of statements which collectively give a portrayal of anarchism which has basically nothing in common with the anarchist movement that's existed for over 200 years. The reason for this error was largely as a result of you using a Facebook meme shared by what was most likely an ANCAP on your friends list as a source of information about anarchism. You then made a series of errors portraying anarchism as though it's defined only by its opposition to the state, which is false, claiming that this opposition to the state is grounded in the belief that people should have a right to do all of the activities that are forbidden by the state, which is false, and also claiming that anarchists advocate breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law, which is false. Now, these common misconceptions highlight a significant degree of ignorance on anarchist theory and practice. You don't seem to understand why anarchists oppose the existing system, what anarchists want to replace it with, and the means advocated by anarchists to achieve an alternative way of doing things. You genuinely seem to know almost nothing about this, which is perhaps why you set up such an elaborate straw man. However, I'm not finished yet. The main reason being that, although I have explained why your representation of anarchism was a straw man that was completely detached from anarchist theory and practice historically, I haven't yet addressed your attempts to knock down this straw man, which also happened to be fundamentally flawed on multiple levels. Some people might call this overkill, I call it having lots and lots of free time. So stay tuned for part 2.